The December rain hammered against the windows of St. Catherine's Cathedral like accusations, each drop a whispered condemnation that Marcus Chen chose to ignore as he stood at his wife's funeral with his mistress's hand resting possessively on his arm. The irony wasn't lost on the 200 people filling the pews, that Isabella Zhao, the woman whose body lay in the bronze casket draped in white roses, had died 3 weeks after giving birth to Marcus's son, and here stood her husband with the woman who'd been warming his bed for the past year, both of them dressed in black that looked more like celebration than mourning. Marcus adjusted his Tom Ford tie with his free hand, his jaw set in that expression of controlled grief he'd practiced in the mirror that morning. At 42, he still possessed the sharp features and calculating eyes that had made him a legend in Silicon Valley, the tech billionaire who'd built NexTech Solutions from nothing into a company worth $3.2 billion. His black suit was custom Brioni, his shoes handmade Italian leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about him screamed success, power, control, except for the way Celeste Moreau kept squeezing his arm like she owned him, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric just enough to remind everyone watching that she'd won. Celeste looked stunning in her grief, or rather, in her performance of grief. At 28, 14 years younger than Isabella had been, she'd dressed in a black Valentino dress that somehow managed to be both appropriate and provocative, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and ice-blue eyes. She'd even managed tears at the right moments, though anyone watching closely might have noticed they never quite reached her eyes. If you're already hooked on this story of ultimate betrayal and karma, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Now let's dive into what happened next. The priest's voice droned through the eulogy, speaking about Isabella's kindness, her dedication to charitable work, her love for the arts. Words that felt hollow because the man who should have known her best was standing there with another woman, and the baby Isabella had died protecting was being held by her sister in the third row, tiny Marcus Chen completely unaware that his mother had sacrificed everything to bring him into this world. Marcus remembered the day the doctors had given Isabella the diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, discovered at her 20-week ultrasound when they'd been checking on the baby. The oncologist had been blunt: terminate the pregnancy immediately and start aggressive treatment, or carry to term and die. There was no third option, no miracle cure, no negotiation with biology. Isabella had chosen Lucas without hesitation. Marcus could still see her face in that sterile consultation room, her hand on her swollen belly, her voice steady even as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I choose my son," she'd said simply. "I choose life." Marcus had argued, of course. Told her she was being irrational, that they could have another child after she recovered, that she couldn't just throw her life away for a fetus that wasn't even born yet. But Isabella had looked at him with those dark eyes that had once made him feel like the most important person in the world and said, "This is my choice, Marcus. My body, my baby, my decision." That had been 7 months ago. 7 months of watching his wife deteriorate while her belly grew, of seeing her smile at ultrasound photos while knowing she was signing her own death warrant, of listening to her plan a nursery she'd never see completed. 7 months that had driven Marcus straight into Celeste's arms, because he couldn't watch the woman he'd married slowly die and still maintain the fiction that he was anything other than terrified. Celeste had been there, convenient and uncomplicated. A marketing executive at one of NexTech's subsidiary companies, she'd made her interest clear from the first company mixer. At first, Marcus had resisted. He was married, his wife was dying, he had standards. But Celeste had been persistent, and Marcus had been weak, and one night after Isabella had fallen asleep exhausted from another round of inadequate pain medication, he'd met Celeste at the Ritz-Carlton and crossed a line he could never uncross. The affair had been careful at first. Secret hotel rooms, encrypted messages, elaborate cover stories about business trips and late meetings. But as Isabella grew sicker and the baby grew larger, Marcus had stopped being careful. He'd started bringing Celeste to company events, introducing her as his close colleague, letting her sit in the seat that should have belonged to his wife at galas and fundraisers. People had noticed, of course. Silicon Valley thrived on gossip, and a billionaire with a dying wife and a beautiful mistress was gossip gold. Isabella had known, too. She'd never confronted him directly, but Marcus had seen it in her eyes during his increasingly rare visits to her bedside, in the way she'd stopped asking him to stay when he made excuses about needing to work late. She'd known, and she'd said nothing, and somehow her silence had been worse than any accusation. Lucas had been born 6 weeks early, a tiny thing weighing barely 5 pounds, his lungs not quite ready for the world. The doctors had performed an emergency C-section when Isabella's body had finally started to fail, when the cancer that had been held at bay by sheer maternal will had decided to claim its due. Marcus had been in Tokyo for a tech conference when he got the call, and he'd made it back just in time to see his son take his first breath and his wife take her last conscious ones. Isabella had held Lucas for 17 minutes before the pain became too much. Marcus had watched from the doorway. He hadn't been invited closer, as his wife looked at their son with a love so pure it hurt to witness. She'd whispered something to the baby that Marcus couldn't hear, kissed his tiny forehead, and handed him to her sister Elena with instructions he'd also missed. Then she'd looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time in months, and said, "Take care of our son. Promise me that, at least." Marcus had promised, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. Isabella had died 3 weeks later, her body finally giving up the fight it had been waging since that terrible diagnosis. She'd been 42 years old, brilliant and kind and dedicated to a man who'd betrayed her in the worst possible way, and Marcus had felt nothing but relief that the ordeal was finally over. Now, standing at her funeral with Celeste plastered to his side, Marcus wondered if Isabella was watching somehow, seeing him choose his mistress over mourning propriety, seeing him wear grief like an ill-fitting costume while planning his next chapter with a woman who didn't even pretend to care about the woman being buried. The service ended with a musical performance, some piece Isabella had loved, Mozart or Beethoven or one of those dead composers she'd spent hours listening to in her final days. Marcus had stopped paying attention to her preferences months ago, stopped pretending to care about the small details that had once defined their relationship. He checked his phone discreetly, seeing messages from his CFO about the quarterly earnings report, from his lawyer about estate matters that needed attention, from Celeste asking when they could leave this depressing place. The procession to the cemetery happened in a blur of black umbrellas and murmured condolences that Marcus accepted with practiced grace. People gripped his hand, told him how sorry they were for his loss, how Isabella had been such a wonderful woman, how tragic it all was. Marcus nodded and thanked them and felt absolutely nothing except impatience for this social obligation to end so he could get back to his real life. At the graveside, rain mixing with the priest's final prayers, Marcus stood watching them lower his wife into the ground and thought about the NexTech board meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday. Thought about the merger talks with a European firm that could push his net worth over $4 billion. Thought about the reservation he'd made at Celeste's favorite restaurant for tomorrow night, because she'd been patient through this whole funeral charade and deserved to be rewarded. He didn't think about Isabella's last words to him. Didn't think about the way she'd looked at Lucas with such fierce protectiveness. Didn't think about the will that her attorney had mentioned needing to be read after the burial, some formality that Marcus assumed would be quick and straightforward. Isabella had been a curator at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art when they'd met, making a modest salary that wouldn't have covered Celeste's monthly shoe budget. She'd inherited nothing from her parents, both academics who'd died young in a car accident when Isabella was in college. She'd lived simply, invested carefully, and as far as Marcus knew, her entire estate consisted of some retirement accounts worth maybe $200,000 and a few personal items that would be distributed among family. The important money, the real money, was Marcus's. NexTech Solutions, the tech portfolio, the real estate holdings across 3 states, the investment accounts that generated more in monthly interest than most people earned in a year. All of it in Marcus's name, protected by the prenuptial agreement his lawyer had insisted on before the wedding. Isabella had signed it without argument, just like she'd signed away her own life to save their son. As mourners began drifting away from the graveside, Marcus felt Celeste's hand slide into his jacket pocket, her body pressing against him in a way that would have been scandalous if anyone had been paying attention. "Can we go now?" she whispered, her breath hot against his ear. This is so depressing, and I'm starving. Marcus was about to agree when a man in an expensive charcoal suit approached, briefcase in hand and expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Chen, I'm Robert Ashford from Ashford & Associates. I was Mrs. Chen's attorney. If you have a moment, we need to discuss the will reading." "Can it wait?" Marcus checked his Rolex, a limited edition piece worth $150,000. "I have a flight to New York tomorrow morning." "I'm afraid not, sir. Mrs. Chen's will specifies that it must be read within 24 hours of her burial, with all named parties present." Robert pulled out his phone, checking something. "We have a conference room reserved at the Fairmont Hotel. It should only take an hour." Celeste's grip on Marcus tightened possessively. "I'm coming with you." Robert's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Miss Moreau, I presume?" "I'm afraid the will reading is for family members and named beneficiaries only." "I'm practically family," Celeste insisted, her voice taking on that petulant edge that usually preceded her tantrums. "Marcus and I are together now. I have every right to be there." "I'm afraid that's not how estate law works." Robert's tone remained polite but firm. "Mr. Chen, shall we say 30 minutes? That should give you time to collect any family members who need to attend." Marcus ended up in the Fairmont's oak-paneled conference room with Elena, Isabella's sister, who'd been giving him looks that could strip paint ever since he'd shown up at the funeral with Celeste. Elena held baby Lucas against her chest, the tiny boy sleeping peacefully despite the tension crackling through the air. At 39, Elena shared Isabella's delicate features and dark eyes, but where Isabella had been soft and accommodating, Elena radiated a quiet fury that made Marcus unconsciously straighten in his chair. Also present was Dr. Margaret Zhao, Isabella's elderly aunt who'd flown in from Beijing, and Father Thomas from St. Catherine's, which struck Marcus as odd since priests didn't usually attend will readings. The conference table was polished to a mirror shine, and someone had set out bottles of water and glasses that no one touched. Robert Ashford opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, pulling out several folders and a laptop. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I know this is a difficult time, but Mrs. Chen was very specific about her wishes being executed promptly." Marcus shifted impatiently. "Can we just get this over with? I have a company to run." Elena's eyes flashed. "Your wife is barely in the ground, Marcus. Show some respect." "My wife made her choices," Marcus replied coldly. "I'm honoring them by being here when I could be working." Robert cleared his throat, the sound sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Shall we begin? I have here the last will and testament of Isabella Marie Zhao Chen, executed 6 weeks before her death and witnessed by myself and 2 associates from my firm." The formality of it made Marcus's attention sharpen. 6 weeks before her death meant Isabella had updated her will right after Lucas was born, probably some maternal instinct to ensure her meager assets were properly distributed. He wondered briefly if she'd left him her collection of art books or that vintage record player she'd loved, and felt a flicker of guilt that he'd probably just donate whatever it was to Goodwill. Robert opened the first folder, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "I, Isabella Marie Zhao Chen, being of sound mind and body, well, relatively sound body under the circumstances, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, superseding any and all previous wills and codicils." Standard legal language. Marcus pulled out his phone, checking his email discreetly under the table. "To my beloved son, Lucas Chen," Robert continued, "I leave my greatest gift, the truth about his mother, in the hope that he will grow to be a man of honor and integrity, qualities his father chose to abandon." Marcus's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Robert kept reading, his voice steady. "I leave Lucas in the care of my sister, Elena Zhao, who has proven herself to be the kind of parent every child deserves. Full legal custody, with all rights and responsibilities, effective immediately upon my death." "What?" Marcus was on his feet now, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "That's not legal. I'm Lucas's father. You can't just give custody to someone else." Actually, Robert said mildly, Mrs. Chen can request custody arrangements in her will, which a court will consider given the circumstances of Lucas's birth and your situation. Elena hugged Lucas closer, her expression triumphant. Keep reading, Robert. To my husband, Marcus Chen, Robert's voice took on a harder edge, I leave the following items: his wedding ring, which I found in his nightstand drawer 3 months ago when he stopped wearing it. The dozen roses he sent to Celeste Moreau on their 6-month anniversary, which I intercepted. And the hotel receipt from the Ritz-Carlton dated the night I went into premature labor, showing a room registered to Mr. Chen and Miss Moreau. The conference room fell silent except for Lucas's soft breathing. Marcus felt blood drain from his face. How did she? Isabella knew everything, Elena said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment you chose that woman over your dying wife. She documented all of it. Robert pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Mrs. Chen hired a private investigator approximately 7 months ago, shortly after her diagnosis. She wanted to ensure she had a complete picture of her life and her husband's activities before making her final decisions. Marcus sank back into his chair, his mind racing. Private investigator. Documentation. Isabella had known, had been watching, had been collecting evidence while he thought her too sick and preoccupied to notice his affair. To my aunt, Dr. Margaret Zhao, Robert continued, I leave my personal collection of Chinese art and antiques, with the request that she donate them to the Asian Art Museum in my name, so that beauty might be preserved beyond my brief time in this world. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. She was a good girl. Too good for some people. And now, Robert said, his tone shifting into something that made Marcus's stomach clench, we come to the matter of Mrs. Chen's estate and assets. I thought she didn't have any assets, Marcus said. Some retirement accounts, maybe her car. Mr. Chen, Robert interrupted, did your wife ever discuss her family background with you? She said her parents died when she was young. That she didn't have much family except Elena and her aunt. Did she ever mention her grandfather? Zhang Zhao. Marcus shook his head impatiently. Some relative in China, I think. She didn't talk about her family much. Margaret made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Zhang Zhao was one of the wealthiest industrialists in China before the Communist Revolution. He fled to Taiwan in 1949 with a fortune that would be worth approximately $4.7 billion in today's currency. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. What? Isabella's father was Zhang Wei's only grandson, Robert explained, pulling out genealogical documents. When Zhang Wei died in 1987, his entire fortune was placed in a trust for his descendants, managed by a consortium of international banks. Isabella's father inherited a portion of that trust, which passed to Isabella when both her parents died. Marcus felt the room spin. You're saying my wife was a billionaire? I'm saying your wife was worth approximately $2.1 billion, all of it held in carefully structured trusts and investments that you knew nothing about because she chose not to tell you. Robert's voice was clinical, professional, but there was an edge of satisfaction underneath. She lived on her curator's salary, invested nothing from the trust, and let it grow quietly while she built a life with a man she thought she loved. That's impossible, Marcus whispered. I would have known. There would have been signs, paperwork, tax documents, all managed by a team of accountants and lawyers who Isabella paid handsomely to keep her privacy intact, Robert replied. She wanted to know that the man she married loved her for herself, not for her family's money. A test, if you will, that you failed spectacularly. Elena's voice cut through Marcus's shock like a blade. Tell him the rest, Robert. Tell him what Isabella decided to do with all that money. Robert flipped to the final page of the will, and his voice took on a tone of absolute finality. I, Isabella Marie Zhao Chen, being of sound mind and deeply disappointed heart, do hereby leave my entire estate, including all trusts, investments, accounts, and assets totaling approximately $2.1 billion, to the following charitable organizations. Marcus stopped breathing. No. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art will receive $500 million to establish the Isabella Zhao Memorial Wing, dedicated to emerging artists who might otherwise never see their work displayed. You can't do this. Children's Hospital Oakland will receive $400 million to establish a pediatric cancer research center in Lucas's name, so that other mothers might have the option Isabella was denied. That's my son's money. The International Women's Health Foundation will receive $300 million to fund research into pregnancy-related complications and maternal mortality, particularly in underserved communities. Marcus was on his feet again, his hands slamming down on the conference table hard enough to make the water bottles jump. This is insane. That money should go to Lucas. I'll contest this. I'll take it to court. There's no way. The remainder, Robert continued, his voice rising to override Marcus's protests, approximately $900 million after estate taxes and legal fees, will be distributed among various charitable organizations focused on cancer research, arts education, and support services for terminal patients and their families. I'll sue. Marcus roared. I'll fight this in every court in the country. That money belongs to my son. Your son, Elena said quietly, is being provided for quite generously. Isabella set up a separate trust fund for Lucas, worth $50 million, that he'll receive when he turns 25. More than enough for college, for starting a business, for building a life. But not so much that he becomes the kind of person his father is. Robert pulled out another document. Mrs. Chen also left a personal letter to be read aloud in the event that Mr. Chen attempted to contest the will. Shall I? Don't you dare, Robert began reading anyway, and Isabella's voice seemed to fill the room through his words, clear and strong despite coming from beyond the grave. Marcus, if you're hearing this letter, it means you've decided that your greed matters more than respecting my final wishes. I'm not surprised. You've spent the last 7 months proving that your needs, your comfort, your desires matter more than anyone else's, including your dying wife and unborn son. I knew about Celeste, Marcus. I knew about all of it. Every lie, every hotel room, every time you chose her over sitting with me during chemotherapy or prenatal appointments. I knew, and I said nothing, because I was focused on something more important than your betrayal. I was focused on giving our son life, even if it cost me my own. You thought I was weak because I chose Lucas over fighting my cancer. You thought I was stupid because I never confronted you about your affair. You thought I was pathetic because I spent my final months planning a nursery I'd never see instead of begging you to love me again. But Marcus, I was none of those things. I was strategic. I was patient. And I was making absolutely certain that when I died, you would finally understand what you'd lost. Not the money, though I imagine discovering I was worth more than twice your net worth must sting quite a bit. No, what you lost was something far more valuable. You lost integrity. You lost honor. You lost the ability to look your son in the eyes someday and tell him you were a good man who made good choices. The $2. $1 billion you're so angry about? It's going to help thousands of people. It's going to fund research that might save mothers like me. It's going to support art and culture and human dignity. It's going to make the world better in ways you never could, because you only know how to make yourself better. Lucas will be fine. He has a trust fund that will give him opportunities and security. But more importantly, he has Elena, who will raise him to be the kind of man who honors his commitments, who values people over profit, who understands that true wealth isn't measured in billions but in the legacy you leave behind. And you, Marcus? You have Celeste. A woman who loved you for your money, your status, your power. I wonder how long she'll stay now that the world knows your wife was worth more than you, that you chose a mistress over a fortune, that you're exactly the kind of man who would bring his girlfriend to his wife's funeral. I don't hate you, Marcus. I pity you. Because you had everything, a woman who loved you, a son to carry your name, a chance to be part of something bigger than your own ego. And you threw it all away for someone who will leave you the moment someone richer or more powerful comes along. My final gift to you isn't the wedding ring or the receipts or the truth about your affair. It's the lesson you're learning right now. Actions have consequences, and some mistakes cost more than money can buy. I hope you enjoy explaining to Lucas someday why his mother died to give him life while his father was busy planning his next chapter with a woman who didn't even respect her memory enough to stay away from her funeral. Goodbye, Marcus. I forgive you for the pain you caused me. But I'll never forgive you for the man you chose to be when I needed you most. With more pity than anger, Isabella. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stood frozen, his hands still pressed against the conference table, his face drained of all color. Elena was crying quietly, holding Lucas close. Dr. Margaret looked at Marcus with an expression of profound disappointment. Father Thomas bowed his head, perhaps praying for Marcus's soul. Robert closed the folder with a soft snap that sounded like a door closing on Marcus's old life. Mr. Chen, you have the right to contest this will, of course. However, I should inform you that Mrs. Chen anticipated that possibility and structured her estate accordingly. Any contest will trigger a clause that redirects Lucas's $50 million trust to charity as well, leaving your son with nothing except what you choose to provide him. She wouldn't, Marcus's voice cracked. She wouldn't punish Lucas for my actions. She wouldn't, Elena agreed. But she knew you might. She knew you'd be willing to destroy Lucas's future just to get your hands on money that was never yours. So she made it very simple, accept the will as written and Lucas gets his trust fund. Contest it, and you prove you care more about money than your son. Marcus sank back into his chair, his mind reeling. $2.1 billion. Gone. Given away to charities and causes that Isabella had cared about, distributed among organizations that would help people Marcus would never meet, funding research in art and programs that meant nothing to him. His phone buzzed, a text from Celeste. How much longer? I'm bored and there's a sample sale at Barney's. Marcus stared at the message, then at the lawyer's carefully neutral expression, then at Elena holding the son he'd barely looked at since birth. He thought about Isabella choosing death to give Lucas life. Thought about her spending her final months documenting his betrayal while he was busy planning his future with another woman. Thought about the fortune she'd hidden from him, not out of malice, but out of hope that he might love her for herself. Mr. Chen? Robert prompted. Do you accept the terms of the will, or shall we proceed with a formal contest? Marcus looked at Lucas, really looked at him for the first time. The baby had Isabella's nose, her delicate features, her peaceful expression even in sleep. $50 million versus nothing. His son's future versus his own greed. I accept, Marcus heard himself say, the words feeling like surrender. I won't contest. Very good. Robert began packing his documents. The estate will be settled within 6 months. Lucas's trust will be established immediately, with Elena as trustee until he reaches majority age. You'll receive the personal items mentioned in the will, the ring, the roses, the receipt, delivered to your office next week. And my son? Elena's eyes were hard as diamonds. Lucas stays with me, Marcus. The courts will formalize custody arrangements, but make no mistake, you lost the right to raise him when you chose Celeste over his dying mother. I have rights, you have supervised visitation rights, twice monthly, pending a family court judge's approval. Robert's voice was flat. Mrs. Chen's will includes testimony from her medical team about your absence during her final months, documentation of your affair, and a rather damning timeline of your activities versus her hospitalization dates. I doubt any judge will grant you more than that. Marcus felt his world crumbling. His wife dead, his fortune surpassed and then given away, his son being raised by his sister-in-law, his reputation about to be destroyed when the news broke about Isabella's hidden billions and her pointed exclusion of him from her will. One more thing, Robert said, pulling out a final folder. Mrs. Chen requested that I provide this to the media upon settlement of the estate. It's a full accounting of her charitable bequests, along with a statement explaining her reasoning. Marcus's blood ran cold. You're going to make this public? Mrs. Chen wanted the world to know that she chose to help people rather than reward the man who betrayed her. Robert's small smile was sharp as a blade. She wanted everyone to understand that some things, integrity, honor, human decency, can't be bought. Even for $2. 1 billion. People will think I'm a monster. People will think you're exactly what you are, Mr. Chen. Elena stood, adjusting Lucas in her arms. A man who valued his own pleasure over his wife's life, who brought his mistress to his wife's funeral, who would have contested a will that benefited thousands just to get money he never earned and never deserved. Dr. Margaret spoke for the first time since the reading began, her English heavily accented but her meaning crystal clear. In China, we have a saying, a man who betrays his wife betrays heaven itself. Isabella gave you everything, Marcus Chen. Her love, her trust, her life to birth your son. And you spat on all of it for a woman who only loves your money. Celeste loves me, does she? Margaret's smile was pitying. Wait until she learns your wife was worth more than you. Wait until she discovers you chose her over $2. 1 billion. Then we'll see how much she loves you. Meanwhile, you and your boy would keep living in a building without heat or electricity, working yourself to death at a job that doesn't pay enough to survive on, and telling yourself that at least you did the right thing. The bitterness in his tone surprised Margaret, revealing an edge she hadn't expected from the gentle old farmer who'd been helping her repair her roof. That sounds like you're suggesting I shouldn't report it. Earl shook his head slowly. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's in that safe, what Henry spent 40 years protecting because he couldn't figure out what else to do with it. What you choose to do with that information is your decision. But I'm also telling you that Henry's honesty didn't help anyone. He followed the rules, tried to report what he had, and got ignored because the official story didn't include a hidden stash of stolen gold in a forgotten post office. He died poor, Margaret. Died in that farmhouse across the road with barely enough money to cover his funeral expenses, because he'd spent his whole life doing the right thing and the right thing had never done anything for him in return. Margaret walked to the safe, placing her palm against the cold steel the way she'd done dozens of times since discovering it. The metal seemed to pulse under her hand, though she knew that was just imagination, just the weight of Earl's words making everything feel more significant than it probably was. A train robbery in 1962. For thieves who'd hidden their take in a post office and then died or disappeared before they could retrieve it. 60 years of secrets locked behind a combination that had died with a man who'd been too honest to profit from what fate had placed in his protection. Do you know the combination? Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. Henry gave it to me the day before he died. Wrote it on a piece of paper and made me swear I'd never use it myself, that I'd only pass it on if the right person came along. Earl reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded slip of paper that had clearly been handled many times over the years, the creases worn soft and the edges rounded from being touched and examined and put away again. I've been holding on to this for 15 years, Margaret. Waiting for someone to buy this building, waiting to see what kind of person would be desperate enough or foolish enough to take on a property that everyone else had written off as worthless. When I saw you and your boy, when I watched you moving in with almost nothing and setting up house in a basement like it was the most natural thing in the world, I knew Henry would have approved. He'd have seen himself in you. Someone who keeps going because the alternative isn't acceptable, even when going means walking into situations you can't control. Margaret took the paper, feeling the weight of it despite its physical lightness. 3 numbers were written in handwriting that had probably been steady once but had grown shaky with age or illness or the emotional burden of what those numbers represented. The combination to a safe that might contain nothing but dust and disappointment. Or might contain something that would change everything about her life and Daniel's future. The gold, she said slowly, if it's really there, if this isn't just a story that got exaggerated over 60 years of retelling. How much are we talking about? Earl's expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning. Henry estimated based on what he'd seen that night, based on the size of the crates and how much they'd weighed. At 1962 prices, he thought it was worth around $4 million. At today's prices, with how much gold has appreciated over the decades. The old man paused, seeming to gather himself before delivering the final number. Somewhere around 140 million, give or take. The figure was so absurd that Margaret almost dismissed it entirely. $140 million hidden in a safe in an abandoned post office that she'd bought for $350 because she couldn't afford rent on a farmhouse. It sounded like a story people told to amuse themselves, the kind of rural legend that grew more elaborate with each retelling until the original truth was buried under layers of embellishment. But Earl's face showed no trace of amusement, and the paper in Margaret's hand felt heavier than any piece of paper had a right to feel. "I need time," Margaret said. "I need to think about this before I do anything." Earl nodded, gathering his coat from where he'd draped it over a chair. "Take all the time you need. That gold has been sitting in there for 60 years. Another few days or weeks won't matter to anyone except you." He paused at the door, turning back with an expression that Margaret couldn't quite interpret. Henry was a good man who made the choice to protect something he didn't understand and couldn't profit from. He spent his whole life waiting for someone to tell him what to do with it, and no one ever did. "Don't make the same mistake, Margaret. Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision. Not Henry's, not mine, not some government agency that wouldn't help Henry when he tried to do the right thing. Yours." The door closed behind him, and Margaret stood alone in the post office with a piece of paper that might be the key to a fortune or might be the beginning of problems she couldn't begin to imagine. She could hear Daniel's breathing from the basement below, the peaceful rhythm of a child who trusted his mother to figure out whatever needed figuring out. That trust felt heavier than the gold Earl had described, more valuable than any amount of money that might or might not be locked in a safe she now had the combination to open. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat in front of the wood stove, feeding it logs to keep the cold at bay, and thought about choices and consequences and the particular cruelty of a universe that kept presenting her with impossible decisions. She thought about Paul, who would have known exactly what to do, who had possessed a moral clarity that Margaret had always envied even when it frustrated her. Paul would have reported the gold immediately, would have trusted the system to handle things properly, would have accepted whatever outcome resulted because he believed that doing right was its own reward regardless of whether that reward came with material benefits. But Paul was dead. Paul's faith in systems and institutions had gotten him a grave in a cemetery and a widow who couldn't afford the headstone he deserved. Margaret had spent 18 months learning that the world didn't reward good behavior, that following rules just meant you suffered while people who broke them prospered, and that the only person she could trust to protect Daniel was herself. The safe sat in the corner of the office, patient and silent, keeping secrets it had held for 6 decades. Margaret could feel its presence even when she wasn't looking at it, a gravitational pull that warped everything around it. She thought about what $140 million could mean. Not just for her and Daniel, but for all the families who were struggling the way she'd struggled, all the children who were growing up in poverty because their parents couldn't catch a single break in a system designed to keep them down. The meeting ended with Marcus sitting alone in the conference room, staring at the polished wood grain of the table and trying to process the magnitude of his loss. Not just the money, though that hurt more than he wanted to admit. But the realization that Isabella had seen through him completely, had documented his failures meticulously, had structured her final act to deliver a message he couldn't ignore: you had everything, and you chose nothing. His phone buzzed again. Celeste, calling this time instead of texting. Marcus answered with trembling hands. Finally. Where are you? I've been waiting in the car for almost 2 hours. The wool reading took longer than expected. Well, hurry up. I'm starving and my feet hurt from those stupid heels you made me wear. Celeste's voice was petulant, demanding. Did Isabella leave you anything good? Maybe some jewelry I can wear? Marcus closed his eyes. She left everything to charity. What? Everything? What about her money? She had more money than I thought. A lot more. And she gave it all away. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, how much more? Does it matter? Marcus, how much money did your wife have? He could lie. Could downplay it. Could protect himself from the judgment he heard forming in Celeste's voice. But what was the point? The story would break within days, maybe hours. Everyone would know. $2.1 billion. The silence that followed was so complete Marcus thought the call had dropped. Then Celeste's voice came back, higher and sharper than before. I'm sorry, did you just say billion? With a B? Yes. Your wife was worth $2.1 billion and she gave it all to charity? Celeste's voice climbed toward hysteria. Marcus, tell me you're contesting the will. Tell me you're fighting this. That's your money. That's our money. If I contest it, Lucas loses his trust fund. Lucas is a baby. He won't even know the difference. Marcus, we're talking about billions of dollars. You have to fight for that. You can't just let it go to some strangers. Marcus thought about Isabella's letter, about her predictions that Celeste would react exactly this way. The will stands, Celeste. I'm not contesting it. Then you're an idiot. She was screaming now, all pretense of grief or decorum abandoned. Do you know what we could have done with that money? Do you know what kind of life we could have had? And you're just giving up because of some moral crisis about a dead woman who hid her wealth from you? She was my wife. She was a liar. She lied to you for your entire marriage. She let you think she was some poor little museum curator when she was sitting on billions. Celeste's breathing was ragged. Jesus Christ, Marcus. I thought you were worth $3 billion. That's why she stopped herself, but the damage was done. Marcus finished the sentence for her. That's why you slept with me. Because you thought I was worth the trouble. Don't put words in my mouth. What am I worth now, Celeste? Now that everyone knows my wife was richer than me? Now that the world knows I brought you to her funeral while she was being buried with a fortune I never even knew existed? More silence. Then, quietly, I need to think about this, Marcus. This changes things. I'm sure it does. Don't be like that. You have to understand, I thought we were building something together. I thought you and I were going to be this power couple, you know? But now, everyone's going to be talking about how you chose me over billions. How you didn't even know what you had. How you're just less than her. I am less than her, Marcus said, the truth settling over him like a shroud. I always was. She just had the grace not to rub it in my face while she was alive. Marcus, go to your sample sale, Celeste. Buy something pretty. Consider it severance pay for services rendered. He hung up before she could respond, turning off his phone completely. In the silence of the conference room, surrounded by the ghosts of his choices, Marcus Chen finally began to understand the depth of what he'd lost. Not the money. Money could be earned again, rebuilt, reclaimed through the tech empire he'd created. What he'd lost was the chance to be the man Isabella had believed in when she married him. The man who would choose honor over convenience, integrity over pleasure, his family over his ego. That man was gone, buried alongside Isabella in the rain-soaked cemetery, mourned by no one except the ghost of who Marcus might have been if he'd made different choices. The news broke 3 days later, exactly as Robert Ashford had promised. Every major outlet picked up the story: billionaire curator's secret fortune, $2. 1 billion charitable bequest, husband's affair exposed posthumously. The headlines were brutal in their accuracy and devastating in their detail. Tech billionaire's wife worth more than him, leaves fortune to charity after his betrayal. Museum curator's hidden $2. 1B goes to good causes while cheating husband gets wedding ring. Isabella Zhao Chen's final gift, billions for charity, justice for betrayed wife. Everywhere. Marcus's phone, once he turned it back on, exploded with calls from reporters, colleagues, investors, and people he hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting statements or explanations or inside information on the scandal rocking Silicon Valley. His PR team crafted careful responses that said nothing while sounding sympathetic. His lawyers reviewed every word to ensure he couldn't be sued for defamation or contractual breach. NexTech Solutions stock dropped 4% in a single day as investors questioned Marcus's judgment, his character, his ability to lead a company when he couldn't even see the fortune sleeping in his own bed. The board called an emergency meeting. The CFO suggested Marcus might want to consider a leave of absence until the media attention died down. The company's reputation, they explained with corporate delicacy, was being damaged by association with a man who'd become shorthand for marital betrayal and spectacular stupidity. Celeste disappeared completely. One day she was texting him dozens of times demanding explanations and reassurances, the next her phone was disconnected and her apartment cleared out. Marcus drove by once and found it empty except for a forwarding address in Miami and a note from the building manager saying Miss Moreau had paid her lease termination fee in cash and left no forwarding contact information. He wasn't surprised. Celeste was many things, but she wasn't stupid. Being associated with Marcus Chen had become social poison, and she'd chosen preservation over loyalty with the same calculation she'd chosen him over fidelity. The invitations stopped coming. The charitable galas where Marcus had once been a featured donor now sent polite regrets that their tables were full. The tech conferences where he'd been a keynote speaker suddenly had scheduling conflicts that prevented his participation. The social circles that had welcomed him as a successful entrepreneur now whispered behind his back about karma and cosmic justice and getting exactly what he deserved. Marcus found himself alone in ways he'd never experienced. Not physically alone, he still had his company, his employees, his apartment with its stunning views of the bay. But emotionally, socially, spiritually alone in a way that made him understand why solitary confinement was considered torture. He started visiting Lucas. The supervised visits Elena had mentioned became a twice-monthly ritual that Marcus approached with the same dread he'd once reserved for root canals. A social worker named Patricia monitored every interaction, taking notes on her tablet while Marcus held his son and tried to figure out how to bond with a baby who had Isabella's eyes and Elena's suspicious glare. Talk to him, Patricia suggested during one particularly awkward session. Babies respond to their parents' voices even when they don't understand the words. Marcus looked down at Lucas, who was 6 months old now and starting to develop a personality. The baby watched him with solemn dark eyes that reminded Marcus painfully of Isabella. What should I say? Tell him about yourself. Tell him about his mother. Tell him what you're feeling. What was he feeling? Marcus examined his emotional landscape and found it surprisingly barren. Grief, yes, but not for Isabella, for himself, for the life he'd thought he was building. Regret, absolutely, but not for betraying his wife, for not realizing what she was worth before she died. Anger, definitely, but directed at Isabella for hiding her wealth, at himself for his blindness, at the universe for setting him up in a trap he'd walked into willingly. Your mother was smarter than me, he finally said to Lucas. She knew that all along, but I was too arrogant to see it. Lucas made a gurgling sound that might have been agreement. She loved you more than anything. More than her own life, obviously. Marcus shifted the baby awkwardly, never quite comfortable with the weight and warmth of him. I should have loved her that way. Should have loved you that way. Should have been the kind of man who deserved what I had. Patricia made a note on her tablet, and Marcus wondered if admitting his failures would count for or against him in the custody evaluations. Your Aunt Elena hates me, he continued. She'll probably tell you terrible things about me when you're older. The worst part is, they'll all be true. Another gurgle. Lucas reached up with tiny fingers and grabbed Marcus's tie, yanking with surprising strength. She left you $50 million. Did you know that? When you're 25, you'll have access to more money than most people see in a lifetime. I hope you use it better than I used mine. I hope you become the kind of person your mother was, not the kind I am. Patricia looked up from her tablet. Mr. Chen, that's good. Keep going. But Marcus had run out of words. He sat holding his son in the sterile visitation room and felt the weight of everything he'd lost pressing down until he could barely breathe. $2.1 billion. Gone. Given to strangers who would use it for research in art and causes that Isabella had cared about. Money that could have secured Lucas's future, funded his education, guaranteed him opportunities that most people could only dream about. Except Lucas already had all of that, courtesy of Isabella's careful planning. The $50 million trust would be more than enough for college, graduate school, starting businesses, buying homes, living comfortably. She provided for their son while simultaneously ensuring that Marcus couldn't benefit from her wealth, Couldn't use her money to fund his lifestyle or support his mistress or pretend that marrying a billionaire made him somehow more impressive. The genius of it made Marcus's chest ache. Isabella had thought of everything, planned for every contingency, structured her final act to deliver maximum impact with surgical precision. She'd let him think he was the powerful one, the successful one, the one who held all the cards. Then she'd died and revealed that she'd been playing a different game entirely, one where winning meant helping thousands of people rather than enriching one undeserving man. 6 months after the funeral, Marcus received a package at his office. Inside was the wedding ring he'd stopped wearing 7 months before Isabella's death, polished and placed in a velvet box with a note, property of a man who didn't deserve it. The dozen roses he'd sent to Celeste, now dried and brittle, arranged in a crystal vase with another note, proof that some things wither while others endure. And the hotel receipt from the Ritz-Carlton, framed like a piece of art, with a final message, "Remember what this cost you." Marcus displayed the receipt in his office, hung it on the wall where he could see it every day. His assistant asked about it once, and Marcus told her it was a reminder about the importance of integrity. She'd looked confused but didn't push for clarification. The truth was more complicated. The receipt represented the exact moment Marcus had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, the night he'd chosen Celeste over Isabella while his wife was in premature labor. He'd been at the Ritz-Carlton celebrating 6 months with his mistress while doctors performed an emergency C-section to save his dying wife and their premature son. If you're still watching, you're witnessing one of the most spectacular falls from grace in modern history. Make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on because the ending of this story will leave you speechless. Now let's see what happens when karma comes full circle. The framed receipt was a reminder that every choice had consequences, that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with money or power or corporate success. It was Marcus's personal hair shirt, his daily penance for being the kind of man who valued pleasure over integrity and convenience over character. A year after Isabella's death, Marcus stood in the Isabella Zhao Memorial Wing at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, surrounded by the kind of beauty his wife had spent her life celebrating. The wing had opened to enormous fanfare. Critics praised its innovative design, its commitment to emerging artists, its dedication to making art accessible to communities that rarely saw themselves represented in major museums. Isabella's portrait hung in the entrance hall, painted from a photograph Marcus recognized from their wedding day. She looked radiant, hopeful, trusting in a way that made his throat close up. Beneath the portrait was a plaque detailing her life, her work, her decision to forego cancer treatment to give birth to her son, and her posthumous gift of $500 million to ensure that artists who might otherwise never be seen could share their vision with the world. She was extraordinary, a voice said beside him. Marcus turned to find a young woman, maybe 25, holding a sketchbook and looking at Isabella's portrait with reverence. "Did you know her?" Marcus asked. "I'm here because of her. My art is on display in Gallery 3, abstract pieces exploring identity and diaspora. I'm the first person in my family to have their work shown in a major museum." The young woman smiled. "Mrs. Chen made that possible. Her grant program gave me the funding to create this collection when no one else would take a chance on me." Marcus looked at the portrait, at the woman he'd married and betrayed and lost. She had good taste. She had good values. The memorial program prioritizes artists from underrepresented communities, people who've been told their stories don't matter. The woman clutched her sketchbook. "I was one of those people. Now I'm one of 23 artists whose work is permanently displayed here, all because Mrs. Chen believed that beauty and truth could come from unexpected places." After the young woman left, Marcus stood alone in front of Isabella's portrait and felt something crack inside his chest. Not grief, he'd already mourned the loss of his comfortable life, his social standing, his illusions about himself. This was something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Understanding of what Isabella had tried to tell him in her letter. True wealth isn't measured in billions but in the legacy you leave behind. Isabella had left a legacy that would endure for generations. Artists whose work she'd funded, researchers whose breakthroughs she'd made possible, programs that would help thousands of people she'd never meet. Her $2. 1 billion wasn't gone, it was multiplied, invested in human potential and creative expression and scientific discovery. What legacy was Marcus building? A tech company that would eventually be sold or broken up or made obsolete by the next innovation. A fortune that would be divided among lawyers and accountants and eventually dissipated through taxes and inflation and poor investment choices. A son who barely knew him and would grow up hearing stories about his father's betrayal from everyone except his father. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Elena for the first time since the will reading. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. "Marcus? I want to establish a trust," he said without preamble. "In Isabella's name. $1 billion from my personal assets, dedicated to causes she cared about." Silence. Then, why? Because she was right about me. About everything. And because Lucas deserves to know his father was capable of learning from his mistakes, even if he learned too late to matter. More silence. Marcus could hear Lucas babbling in the background, happy sounds that made his chest ache. "I'll have my attorney contact yours," Elena said finally. "But Marcus? This doesn't make us okay. This doesn't erase what you did to my sister." "I know. I'm not trying to erase anything. I'm trying to honor who she was, even though I didn't while she was alive." The trust was established 3 months later, the Marcus and Isabella Chen Foundation, dedicated to supporting the arts, funding medical research, and providing services for terminal patients and their families. Marcus transferred $1 billion of his personal wealth, reducing his net worth significantly but not catastrophically. NexTech Solutions remained profitable. His lifestyle remained comfortable. But he'd chosen to give away a fortune he'd actually earned, money that was legally and morally his, to honor the memory of a woman he'd failed to appreciate until it was too late. The media covered it, of course. Guilty conscience or genuine change? Marcus Chen donates $1 billion to honor late wife's legacy. The coverage was skeptical, questioning his motives, suggesting it was a calculated PR move rather than genuine remorse. Marcus didn't bother responding to the speculation. He knew the truth, that no amount of money could buy back what he'd lost, but it might help him become someone Lucas wouldn't be ashamed to call father. On Lucas's second birthday, Marcus sat in Elena's living room watching his son destroy a cake shaped like a dinosaur. The boy was beautiful, bright-eyed and curious, with Isabella's delicate features and something of Marcus's determined chin. He called Elena Mama and looked at Marcus with polite confusion, like a friendly stranger who visited sometimes bearing gifts. "He's doing well," Marcus said, watching Lucas smear frosting across his face with gleeful enthusiasm. Elena sat beside him, her expression softer than it had been in 2 years. "He is. He's happy, healthy, curious about everything. You're doing a good job raising him. I'm doing what Isabella would have wanted. Making sure he knows he's loved, that his mother chose him over everything, that family means loyalty and trust and sacrifice." Marcus absorbed that, the implicit criticism that he'd exemplified none of those values during Isabella's life. "I want him to know about the foundation. When he's old enough to understand, I want him to know I tried to honor his mother's memory." "I'll tell him," Elena promised. "But Marcus, you should know, I'm also going to tell him the truth about everything that happened. About Celeste, about the funeral, about the will. He deserves to know the whole story, not just the redemption arc you're trying to write." "I understand. Do you?" Elena turned to face him fully. "Because Lucas is going to grow up knowing his mother died to give him life while his father was busy with his mistress. He's going to know you brought that woman to his mother's funeral. He's going to know you didn't even realize what you'd lost until it was publicly exposed. That's the legacy you've actually left, Marcus. The $1 billion is just you trying to buy absolution." The words stung because they were true. Marcus watched Lucas, who'd finished destroying his cake and was now working on demolishing the wrapping paper from his presence. "I can't change what I did," he said quietly. "I can only try to be better going forward. For him, if not for myself." Elena's expression softened fractionally. "The social worker says you've been consistent with visits." That you're trying to engage with Lucas, learning how to be present even when it's uncomfortable. Patricia has very detailed notes about my inadequacies as a father. But you keep showing up. That matters, Marcus. Not as much as being faithful to your dying wife would have mattered, but it's something. They sat in silence, watching Lucas play, until Elena spoke again. Isabella used to talk about you, those last few weeks. She'd tell me about the man you were when you first met, before NexTech, before the money and success went to your head. She said you used to stay up all night talking about changing the world, about building something that mattered beyond profits. I was younger then. More idealistic. Or maybe you were more honest. Maybe that version of Marcus Chen is still in there somewhere, buried under the corporate success and the guilt and the regrets. Elena stood, moving to wipe frosting off Lucas's face despite his protests. I think Isabella believed in that version of you, even at the end. Otherwise, she wouldn't have left you those items, the ring, the roses, the receipt. She would have just cut you out completely. I don't understand. She was giving you a mirror, Marcus. Showing you exactly who you'd become. Because she hoped that seeing it might make you choose to become someone else. Elena lifted Lucas from his high chair, the boy immediately wrapping sticky arms around her neck. The question is whether you're capable of that transformation, or if you're just going through the motions because it looks better for your reputation. Marcus drove home that night thinking about mirrors and transformations and the man he'd been versus the man he'd become. The $1 billion donation wasn't enough, he understood that now. Money could build museum wings and fund research and support charitable causes, but it couldn't resurrect a marriage or resurrect integrity or bring back a woman who'd deserved so much better than what he'd given her. But maybe Elena was right. Maybe there was still time to become someone Lucas wouldn't be ashamed of, someone who understood that true wealth came from how you treated people, not how many zeros appeared in your bank account. 5 years after Isabella's death, Marcus stood in the same cathedral where they'd held her funeral, this time for a memorial service honoring her life and legacy. The Isabella Zhao Memorial Wing had become one of the most visited spaces in San Francisco, showcasing artists who'd never had opportunities before her posthumous gift. The Cancer Research Center in Lucas's name had made breakthrough discoveries in pancreatic cancer treatment, offering hope to patients who might face the same impossible choice Isabella had faced. The foundation Marcus had established in their names had distributed hundreds of millions to causes Isabella had cared about, building on her legacy in ways that honored her values and vision. It wasn't redemption. Marcus had learned that some mistakes couldn't be redeemed, only acknowledged and learned from, but it was something. A small step toward being the man Isabella had believed he could be when she'd married him 20 years ago. Lucas attended the memorial service, now 7 years old and starting to ask questions about his mother that Elena answered with careful honesty. He knew she'd died to give him life. He knew she'd been extraordinary, brilliant, generous beyond measure. He was beginning to understand that his father had made terrible choices, had hurt his mother deeply, had spent the years since trying to make amends for failures that couldn't really be fixed. "Did you love Mama?" Lucas asked Marcus after the service, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. Marcus knelt down to his son's eye level, aware that Elena was watching from across the room, that this answer would matter more than anything he'd ever said in a boardroom or keynote speech. "I did love her," he said honestly. "But I loved myself more. I loved my own comfort, my own desires, my own ego more than I loved your mother or you. And that's something I'll regret for the rest of my life." Patricia says you're trying to be better now. I am. But trying doesn't erase what I did, Lucas. It just means I'm choosing to learn from my mistakes instead of repeating them. Lucas considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "Aunt Elena says Mama forgave you. That she wrote it in her letter." "She did. Your mother was more generous than I deserved. Then I guess I can forgive you too." But Patricia says forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and I shouldn't forget what happened even if I forgive. Marcus felt his throat close up. Patricia's very smart. She says lots of things. Mostly about how grown-ups make mistakes and kids shouldn't repeat them. Lucas reached out and took Marcus's hand, his small fingers warm and trusting in a way that felt unearned. "I'm glad you're trying to be better, Dad." Mama would probably be glad too. For the first time in 5 years, Marcus cried. Not for himself or his lost fortune or his damaged reputation, but for the woman who'd given everything for their son, who'd structured her final act to teach him lessons he'd been too proud to learn while she was alive, who'd forgiven him even though forgiveness was more than he deserved. "Your mother was the best person I ever knew," he told Lucas through his tears. "I hope you grow up to be like her, not like me." Lucas hugged him, and Marcus held his son close, breathing in the scent of grape juice and childhood and possibility. Maybe he couldn't change the past. Maybe he couldn't undo the betrayal or resurrect the marriage or become the husband Isabella had deserved. But he could be present for Lucas. Could teach his son through example that mistakes had consequences but didn't have to define a life. Could honor Isabella's memory not just through charitable donations but through the harder work of becoming a better man. Thank you so much for watching this story until the very end. If this tale of ultimate consequences and hard-won redemption moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I have more incredible stories coming that you won't want to miss. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder that our choices define us more than our wealth ever could. And drop a comment telling me what you thought about Marcus's journey. See you in the next story. The cathedral bells rang out as people began filing out, their sounds echoing across San Francisco with a clarity that cut through fog and regret and the weight of years. Marcus walked out holding Lucas's hand, Elena on the boy's other side, 3 people bound together by loss and blood and the memory of a woman who'd taught them all different lessons about integrity, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. Isabella Zhao had died at 42, leaving behind a son who would never know her, a husband who'd failed to appreciate her, and a legacy worth far more than $1 billion. She'd left the world better than she'd found it, had chosen generosity over bitterness even in her darkest hours, had structured her final gift to transform her personal tragedy into collective hope. And Marcus Chen, who'd brought his mistress to her funeral thinking he'd already lost everything that mattered, was still learning that some fortunes can't be measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios or corporate valuations. Some fortunes are measured in the lives you touch, the people you help, the legacy you leave when you're gone. He'd lost a $1 billion inheritance he'd never known existed. But in losing it, he'd gained something more valuable, the chance to become someone worthy of his son's respect, his late wife's forgiveness, and his own ability to look in the mirror without shame. It wasn't redemption. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you got.